Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. My name is Molly Yanus with Echo Consulting. Today we're going to be talking about achieving strategic alignment with project intake and prioritization. So again, Molly Yanus, founder, Echo Consulting. We're a project management services organization. We do a lot with PMO implementation, project management office implementation. I'm also the founder of StrAlign, a strategic alignment software to help organizations. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the very end, but for the most part, we'll be talking about project prioritization today. For rules of engagement, I am the question queen. Feel free to raise your hand. Feel free to jump in with a question. We are going to be recording this, and also we're going to be, I think, recording, transcribing, etc. So if you've signed up for this webinar and with your email, we'll go ahead and send that to you after this. So you're welcome to take screenshots, you're welcome to take notes, but we will be sending this to you afterwards. You're also welcome to do chat. We got a couple members of the team in here that can view the chat. So I'm going to jump right in on our topic today. And so one of the questions that we have is, what is one of the biggest challenges that you face when you're managing your projects, multiple projects? And we're going to cheat and actually give you kind of the results of the survey that PMI did. So the biggest challenge you face when managing projects, and the second biggest is project prioritization. Shockingly, I'm sure you'll all be shocked if you're interested in this topic, that resource management remains the #1 issue with project management, multiple projects, right? Making sure that you have the right resources, they're available, who to assign to what project, conflicting resources, between projects and things like that. There's also definitely major issues with challenges with managing projects in terms of visibility and reporting. One of Echo's really focuses is on that transparency, accountability, the ability to see the information across the organization, across projects and things like that. And then project financial management. So that jumps into change management and things like that. But again, for today's call, for today's webinar, we are going to be focusing specifically on project prioritization. For the most part today, we're going to be talking about project intake and prioritization. So if you think about that, we're talking mostly about when projects are initially identified, initially reviewed, business case, whatever that process looks like, and then moving into actually starting the delivery. But we'll be talking a little bit about project prioritization throughout the life of the project, not just that initial approval as well. So again, today's webinar focusing on project prioritization, intake process, etc. Which element of project prioritization is the most challenging? So another poll, again, done by PMI, Project Management Institute. Which element of project prioritization? So specifically today, we're going to be focusing on the top 3. So one is aligning projects with the corporate strategy, with the goals, with KPIs, etc. Scoring the value of portfolio projects, whether it's return on investment, whether it's understanding kind of what part of the organization you're working on. Also modeling scenarios to optimize portfolio value, saying no to some projects in the portfolio. So what we see with a lot of our clients is, by the time they get to that project approval step, maybe they had a business case, maybe they don't, maybe it's just a more streamlined, fast-tracked version. We have a really difficult time actually saying no. Versus taking on more projects, more works in progress than the organization can do. And then the other piece, and again, these are still topics that are very near and dear to my heart. So modeling scenarios and scenario planning, as well as tracking the value of portfolio projects and kind of long-term value as well as short-term value. Very interesting. But again, today our focus is going to be on how we select projects, how we identify projects, how we score them, and how we make sure that the projects that we're actually working on, that we're dedicating our resources and our time and our effort and everything towards, are the ones that are best aligned with our organization's strategic goals. Now, there's always a big question, is definitely with StrAlign, as we've been rolling it out, we're finding more and more organizations that really struggle with articulating these goals. So we'll be talking just a little bit about goal articulation as well today. So you may or may not be in the situation, but we've had a lot with, the senior leadership is really responsible for kind of that strategy, the goals, where are we going, that long-term vision. They're probably part of, maybe some of that project selection, whether that's through an annual planning process and budgeting and everything. But then we have the project delivery team, some of which are actually maybe part of an actual PMO or project team, but some of them are actually just operational resources. They're part of, customer success or, even sales and marketing and warehouse and wherever they are, supply chain. And they have this feeling that there's constantly changing priorities, right? We're adding more, we're adding this, we're adding, very little subtract, lots of works in progress, constantly shifting priorities. How do we bridge this gap between the strategy, the strategic, the long-term goals, the value that you're looking to go for with the actual projects and which projects should be? So that's what we're going to be talking a little bit about today. I just like to add some of that emotion that you might be feeling. I'll talk as we go through this, we're going to be talking about it in kind of the echo approach. This is a little bit cheesy. If you've heard form, norm, storm, or form, storm, norm, this is very similar concept, right? So it's like engaging in how are we identifying the stakeholders? How are we articulating these goals? That conflicting priorities, different visions about what needs to happen. How are we harmonizing, compromising, negotiating, making sure everyone's on the same page? What trade-offs do we have? How do we have that shared vision? And then how do we really set ourselves up so that we can own that there's alignment, governance, and success? So we're going to start with engage, and we're going to be talking about the project intake process, some of the roles and responsibilities, as well as best practices and considerations. And I want to be very clear here. As I'm talking about these roles, we have organizations with 900 plus projects, right, with crazy approval processes and governance committees and multiple different things. We also have organizations that are small startups, that are engineering organizations, Echo itself, right, where, we're a small team and everything, and it's really a one-person or two-person decision-making process. Any way around it, whether it's formalized or not, whether it's standardized or not, whether you think you have a process or not, this exists in how we identify work and how we move forward. So at the very highest level, when we're thinking about intake roles, we're thinking about who is requesting the work, who wants the work, who is identifying the work, who is reviewing the work and assigning the work, and then who is actually completing the work. And in small organizations, you might be in all three of these buckets. In large organizations, there might be multiple levels for reviewers and approvals and things like that, and huge amounts of teams and departments and disciplines and everything for the doers. Anyway, around it, there's this concept of who's asking for it, right? Who's reviewing it and saying what makes it through, and then who's actually executing on it. But aside from that, right, and I want to just give an example, like a more complex PMO, for example. So you might have someone that's the VP of supply chain, right? And you might have the requester be a director of inventory or something like that. And then the actual director might be someone else's. So the requester can actually be a team, an individual. They can be the sponsor, the executive sponsor, the budget owner, etc. Oftentimes they're having to make a request because the request is actually impacting multiple different teams or departments or something like that. There's some sort of reviewer, and they're kind of like the gatekeeper of the resources oftentimes, whether that's finance, whether that is access to, IT, whether that is access to specific resources or subject matter experts. And then there are doers that are oftentimes the project teams or operations teams, whatever that looks like for your organization. In general, requesters of work want it yesterday. It's obviously the most important because they have their their view of what's most important. They typically are trying to articulate the solution before actually like identifying what the problem is. And almost always they want a quick and easy fix, and they don't want all the process because the process is super heavy. And they really want to know when it's going to be done. And they're probably giving you a date that they think it should be done, and there's some sort of, without any review or commitment or anything like that. So no one's ever met a requester of work like this, right? No one's ever, been requested work and it's like, oh, we just want it quick and easy. This is, this is low hanging fruit, all those other things, right? And oftentimes this requester too doesn't want a lot of process. They're not really interested in a whole bunch of the documentation and like how the sausage is made, right? They're just looking for the easy fix, and they're looking at it from their perspective oftentimes. From a reviewer standpoint, most likely they're a resource manager, and it's not only people resource manager, but they have limited resources, time, people, budget, etc. The change management is hard because they have to look at all the inbound requests, but they're also looking at what's already happening. They honestly typically focus on the projects and initiatives that are already in flight. So they're the ones that have already been approved, that are already have project team members associated with them. So their focus tends to naturally be biased towards what is already in progress. They really typically, like, they really want to be strategic, right? A lot of these people want to be strategic. They took the role to be strategic and things like that, but they get bogged down in day-to-day escalations. And again, I want to separate again kind of that small company feel from that larger company feel. Larger, more mature PMOs and everything, their reviewers can be 2, 3, 4 levels, right? You can have an initial subject matter expert, you can have an analyst, you could potentially have a sponsor review or something like that. Oftentimes there's reviews associated with alignment, but there's also reviews associated with finance and things like that to go forward to here. They always want to know what the status is and why isn't the data up to date, and maybe they don't have enough information. How are they supposed to decide on projects and things like that if they don't have enough information? So there's this constant push and pull and everything about how do you have enough information to make a decision but not have too much information, and you put too much effort in before you actually go ahead and approve. And then finally, the doer. So oftentimes we're getting requests from multiple different places, even within a single major project. There could be multiple different things that need to get done. They have 10 different priorities. I'm not sure how my work map backs to my company's success. Oftentimes when we get so bogged down, we're working on a specific project. How am I actually moving the needle forward for my company, for my team, for my career, right? And then also requirements are constantly changing. So again, the doer intake roles, another project's coming in, they don't have that same level of excitement always, right? Because they're not seeing the map of the big picture. So I talked about these 3 roles in terms of requester, reviewer, and doer, and this is the most simplistic model, right? But really, oftentimes for the requester, there's some sort of intake process that includes providing minimal data, minimal information. Maybe it's the problem, maybe it's the name of it, maybe it's the requested due date, et cetera. They want to see once they put in that request, well, what's going on? What's the status of that request? When's it going to happen? Did I get approved? And then once it's actually completed the work, they actually want to have a chance to say, yeah, you actually delivered what I asked for. Oftentimes they're involved throughout, but again, the requester could be a sponsor. It could be a project team member or lead going through, but some sort of way of saying, hey, this needs to happen. What's going on? And then at the end being like, yep, this is closed out. We completed it. Reviewer, the big piece, and this is what we're going to be talking a lot about today, is that review and assignment process. But then also once that project gets kicked off, once it's actually in delivery, what is the status? And oftentimes this reviewer ends up, if they're a PMO director, if they're a marketing director, if they're depending, IT director, whatever the work identified is getting managed by, right? They want to see the status throughout. So how do they have access without interrupting the doers constantly to say, what's going on? Where is this at? Is this still on the same timeline and things like that? So they want to be able to see the status. And that's that big piece of transparency and accountability throughout the entire process and the pass off between the different teams. And then finally, the doers that are going ahead and completing work once it's been authorized. And then, once the work is complete, and sometimes we have organizations, right, like lessons learned, or maybe they celebrated a launch or something along those lines, but they want to see that this actually moved the needle and what they worked on means something and is live and is helping the team. So at that point, they really want to see the status as well, even after this project is complete. And I assure you that they don't want to know what the status is because they never get to roll off the project because they weren't able to actually transition this back to operations. But they do want to be able to see that their work means something, don't we all? So if I break it down and I think about project intake, one of the big pieces that we start with is this intake form, and we have a lot of different versions of this, right? But what's the minimal viable information that you need in order to be able to go ahead and track it and kind of start that initial review and approval process? So oftentimes there's some sort of contact information, right, about leads or something like that. There's usually some sort of date, even though it's not committed to, but some sort of when do we want this by? Some sort of description. Sometimes we have organizations that do require high-level business requirements early on and ROI impact. Most of the time, especially kind of for our more mature, there's kind of a multi-process, right? There's this very minimal information to try to avoid barriers to entry. We want to have all of our different ideas and things like that out there. And then over time, after an initial review, after additional people get involved, then we kind of build out more robust business cases and ROI and things like that. And some organizations, small organizations, they're really not at the point where they're even really tracking ROI, or especially from like a financial basis. But even just a statement of what we're trying to accomplish with this, so that it's a yes or no, we did accomplish it or not, is so important. Maybe there's documentation or attachments. Maybe there's some stakeholder impact and things like that. But there's definitely some like different concepts. One of the pieces that I want to mention, and I talked about it, which is like oftentimes we see this intake process broken up into several different steps. So the first one is an idea, very, very minimal information, but then progressive elaboration. So as it makes it to that next stage, what additional information is available at that stage? What additional expectations are needed? We're working with an organization right now where we are just talking about a very complex intake, approval, review, and approval process across, I think it's like 6 different steps with different teams and everything. But it's really important to remember the concept of like fast track as well. So it's like, does every single project or work product, or whether you call them initiative project, product, etc., does everything need to go through a review and approval, or are there only certain ones? Is there a cadence to that? So often for like our more product management heavy organizations, right, they might have quarterly planning like they might have sprints, but then they might also have this additional planning increments that they do as well. And then for some of our organizations, they're coming in, like some of our clients right now, we're coming into annual planning season, right? So like budgeting season, what are those big budgets? And maybe that's really how it is. But what we want to make sure is that we have this progressive elaboration. Let's not lose sight of ideas, potential work, etc., because we're waiting for the level of detail or documents. So project charter or business case or, high level business requirements, ROIs, all those different things. Like, let's capture what we have now, understanding that we might need additional perspectives and things like that. When you get to that estimation piece of things, definitely something that we struggle. So how do we have enough information to provide a estimation? So there's this gut check concept. So like oftentimes we use t-shirt sizes, for example, or ranges, and then as it matures, as you get more information, you're becoming more and more accurate. You're expecting your confidence to increase. Okay. If we think about view status, so Echo does a lot with organizations that are implementing PMOs, and or one of our big products that we use is Smartsheet, but definitely other other work management platforms as well. A lot with dashboarding, whether it's Power BI, Tableau, like dashboarding, whatever those organizations are. But very often we're looking for a way to see like the status and the visibility and everything without just getting push notices. Like we're so overwhelmed with notifications, emails, chat messages, channel messages, whatever system you use. So where is the one place that I can go? And oftentimes we say a report or a dashboard or something like that, where I can see all of the open requests. I can see everything that's going on so that I can orient myself in order to understand where I fall in there. And ideally, I'm seeing that not just in the context of my personal list of things that I'm interested in, but I'm seeing it also in the context of everything that's going on, whether it's my team or my department or my organization. And that's really the first step towards strategic alignment, is being able to see across, so that you're not just in your silo. You've probably heard about, siloed organizations, et cetera. But oftentimes when we think about goals, and we'll get there in just a second, is there's multiple different levels of goals, right? So there's, high level organizational goals, and oftentimes they're strategic goals, they're multi-year, they're kind of like where we're going long term. But then there's also more concrete, more measurable goals, et cetera, that might be at an organization level or at a team level or department level, et cetera. So in order to kind of get to that next step, we need to be able to see all the things that are in play, the things that are potentially coming in, the things that are already in play, and you want to be able to see that in in specifically the things that you're most interested in, but also in the context of the larger picture of other things that are going on as well. So oftentimes with our clients, we're talking about push notifications, what actually requires you to get notified. So an example in an intake process would be, oh, hey, a new idea was submitted, or this is going to be coming up for review at the next governance meeting or something like that. But then also pull information, which is where can I go to look at where this is? When I submit something, this is like the cardinal sin that we see a lot with intake processes and even with feedback, right? You submit a form and then that's it. You don't have it. You can't see what the status of it is. You can't see if anyone looked at it or if anything was done, let alone if anything was actually getting executed on for the feedback. But how do we provide that visibility throughout the life cycle of that request instead of just being able to submit that initial form and then not know where it is, right? How do I know if it's going to get reviewed, if anyone's looking at it, if I need to ask, et cetera? And then this approval process, this is really important. This is typically more kind of at that end game, but what is the workflow that is needed for that approval? How many different stakeholders are involved in that? And this approval process can happen, again, I typically think of this in the whole project lifecycle, but if we think about it in just that intake prioritization, do I get a chance to say, this is my vote for this project versus this project? How do I know which stakeholders should be involved in deciding which ones go forward? And then does something get approved by default after a period of time? Not something we recommend, but something we've seen some. And then honestly, what is that workflow if something gets rejected? Does it get rejected because there's not enough information to determine right now? Is it rejected because there's not enough budget this year? Is there a reopened workflow? Do you have this concept of backlog of projects and ideas that could happen down the road? So being able to kind of see what that review and approval process. I'll just take a step. Any breath? Any questions? Just gonna keep diving through. This review and assignment process, right, is review by the whole governance committee, all the directors, maybe C-suite. Is it dependent on, so some of this information, sorry, is still targeted. If it's reviewed, but it's not their team, like, is there some sort of acknowledgement of the review? Is there some sort of service level agreement, SLA, in terms of what a review turnaround would be? What if there's questions or clarifications? You don't have enough information about the project to determine. Oftentimes we see this if there's like a vendor requirement, if there's an outsider, if there's pricing and things like that, what information is needed. So there's so much work that gets done prior to the project actually getting approved that still needs to be tracked and managed and things like that. When you assign a project, let's say a project does get approved or you're thinking about approving it, how are you determining the resourcing availability? So definitely budgeting availability from a finance standpoint, but individuals, do you have the right resources on there? Do you have an estimate that is reasonable? And then prioritization in terms of when it can be started. So oftentimes one of the things we're talking about our clients with is not just whether the project should happen or this effort should happen, prioritization, product, same thing, is it still the same priority if you can't get to it for 6 months, right? And the timing does matter. From a status of the standpoint afterwards, right? So like, what is the status, both for when the project happens, but also like if it does get moved. And let's say oftentimes we'll see some of our larger organizations, they approve a project, but just because you approve that a project's going to move forward doesn't necessarily mean that you have the resources or the ability to start it immediately. So is there a cycle that goes back between potentially resource management and individual resource managers and the strategic leadership, project governance, et cetera, that's actually saying, yes, go ahead with this project. So, and again, for viewing status, oftentimes we're working with dashboards, we're working with reporting. Oftentimes, even, right now, organizations might be using PowerPoint or something else, but like to see the status of a request, what does that mean? Whether it's health, whether it's scope, schedule, budget, schedule primarily, dependencies with other things, how do we provide that visibility? And what if a due date is not feasible? How is that communicated and updated? And that can happen pre-approval or post-approval. Let's see here. We talked a little bit about that in terms of just like when you're completing the work, status and viewing status and things like that. And then let's see here. So now we're going to dive right in. So that was talking primarily about like the high level intake process, how we identify work, kind of, and the different players that are involved. We're now going to talk about the conflicts between between. So this is like this would be an example of like a single request, right? A single request comes in, they want to see what the status of it is, you want to review and assign that specific request, they want to see completing of the work. That's just one. But in many cases, we have many, many different things. Project team members might be on many different projects, many different products, many different initiatives. So now we're going to be talking more about the conflict side of it. So conflicting priorities, prioritization drivers, what we're actually looking at. So when we talk about that resource management, who do I have for project X? Which is more important from this project or the other project? This might not work for my team. I thought that, who thought that was going to work? Maybe you find out after the fact that this new project is coming in, no go. Oh, I told you so. It still happened anyways. So frustration, right? Burnout, over budget, behind schedule, low ROI. We're just adding more and more and more. We're not saying no. We're not moving. So one of the things we want to talk about is this balance between, spending a ton of time in the intake and approval process versus executing. It's really important that we understand the minimal viable information in order to be able to prioritize. And so that's really critical piece whenever we're talking about this implementation is like, what's the minimal information you need in order to be able to make a decision? And who has that information? Oftentimes we see a review and approval process where maybe it's only senior leaders in governance, right? But you don't have the actual subject matter experts, whether it's a product owner, whether it's a business system owner or something like that involved early enough. And it can really cause issues. The other side of it is, teams working for 80, 120 hours, working on a business case and working on these different things before it's actually getting approved, and that's taking away from kind of those approved. And oftentimes, maybe a single team or a single business subject matter expert or something might not understand kind of the wider picture, again, across those strategic goals. So we talk a little bit about analysis paralysis. So most productive, right? There's a point of diminishing returns and there's a point of maximum. So what we don't want to do is spend the same amount of time evaluating all the different options and losing time on the actual delivery and benefits and things like that. So prioritization drivers, this is really important when we start talking about that strategic alignment piece. So it's like, we want to understand what outcomes, right, we're looking for and how they relate to the strategic goals, whether you have KPIs, whether you have OKRs, whether you have like all these different concepts, but like the strategic vision, the strategic themes of your organization. How do these projects, how do these target outcomes, how does this work that you're doing align with those? Because if you don't understand how that works, one, like motivation and everything, but two, oftentimes we're working on projects because the loudest person or it's the most recent request instead of how this acts as that. So some of the like high level prioritization driver examples, right? So very high level, simplistic, even, increasing sales and revenue, decreasing costs, improving profitability, productivity, brand positioning. Oftentimes there's compliance pieces or maybe end of life issues for some, if you're talking about software or manufacturing equipment or something like that. Maybe you have quality concerns or capacity concerns, et cetera. So these are just some like really, really high level driver concepts. But we actually have a blog, I think Amanda, put it out recently about strategic goals and examples of strategic goals and things like that. Amanda, if you want to drop that in, that would be great. But really identifying kind of like what's driving and making sure that the projects that we're looking for are being evaluated against these drivers, these strategic goals, et cetera. It's important that we understand what they are, what they mean. These are not SMART by any means, so they're not specific, they're not measurable particularly. So we want to make sure that we are providing a little bit more detail than this, but these are kind of like that, like traditional kind of driver sense that we're looking for. So when I don't know what's happening here. I'm going to, that's weird. I clicked on something I shouldn't. So then the next question we have, and this is where we're really going to start diving into that strategic alignment piece, which is how well aligned are your projects to the strategic business priorities? What we found as we started rolling out StrAlign and everything is that we're finding a lot of organizations that they really don't know necessarily their strategic goals, and or they know their strategic goals at one level, let's say organization wide, or specific level as in their individual goals or their individual team goals, but across the organization, across those levels, it's harder. So how well aligned are your projects to the strategic business goals? Again, this is done by that PMI organization. So in general, we got about 50, about half people saying that they're somewhat aligned, right? And then about a quarter that are saying very well aligned, and about a quarter that are saying not very well aligned, right? So here we go. So if we're not aligned, right, what can we do about that? So let's start talking about kind of some of those strategic goals, some of that alignment and things like that. So we're going to talk a little bit about harmonizing, making sure that we have what we need in order to be strategically, to drive strategic alignment. And then we'll talk a little bit about balancing portfolios and some of the tools that we use for prioritization. So when we're talking about strategic alignment, one of the big things that we're talking about is communication. So one of these examples that we give for ECHO oftentimes is when you're talking about communication methods and you're talking about whether it's in a PMO, whether it's in a regular organization, a nonprofit, wherever you are, right? How much time are you spending trying to communicate, right, in person, in meetings, instant messaging, emails, different meetings that you might have, different cadences, daily stand-ups, weekly, monthly, etc. What happens is what the most vocal people, the loudest people in the room, sometimes the highest paid people in the room, have far more representation than the quieter people. This is becoming especially apparent and especially important as we have a more remote workforce. But there are some ways to kind of like shift our communication methodology, right, in order to be able to provide a wider audience, a wider understanding of people that may not be as loud. And so some of the things that we talk a lot about is that when we're looking to prioritize, we don't want to limit ourselves to just being in a meeting where we are, showing a slide, showing information ahead of time, but how do we actually capture input, including from the C-suite as well as, leadership, in a little bit more democratic way, but a little bit more data-driven way, right? Like being able to use data-driven decision, best science and best practices and things like that. So we're going to talk a little bit more about prioritization. Oftentimes this is considered scoring, for example. So voting surveys and really expecting that everyone goes ahead and provides their opinion a little bit more independently, and how we might be able to use that to be a little bit more effective. In meetings, right? Oftentimes we talk about like max meeting size and things like that, but a lot of these approval or prioritization meetings and things like that, they can be very heavy. They can be very, very expensive. And we come out of it and everyone didn't hear the same thing, and or everyone didn't feel like they were heard or their position mattered. It can often make us feel honestly frustrated and just kind of disengaged that it wasn't really worth it. So to start with this, one of the things we're going to do, it's a really funny exercise we do like with prioritization really early on. It's like the most basic one, but it's a good articulation. And the example we use is, okay, if your house is on fire, and this is really going to get us to the Eisenhower method and some of prioritization methodology that we use. But if your house is on fire, as you think about what what you need to get out of the house, right? Just the way you're thinking of it, the initial order that you put it in is not always indicate the priority. So if you look at initial projects and everything, it's not the, most recent goes in first or the oldest is the one that needs to get reviewed. You kind of need to do prioritization even ahead of that. And so one of the most common and most well-known methods is called the Eisenhower method. And it's talking about things that are urgent and important versus things that are maybe not as important and not as urgent. So I'm hoping that the most urgent thing if your house is on fire is that you get your family out, that you get any people out, probably any pet, any living items, right? But then there's things that maybe are not as urgent if your house is burning down in terms of like bringing your couch out, maybe like books and things like that, but maybe pictures or something that are urgent. And so anyways, there's the different concepts. I think everyone's probably heard of urgent, important versus non-urgent, not important. I like to use the house on fire example to kind of get our heads on straight when we start talking about prioritization. Some of the ways for prioritization that we use that are kind of more mathematical and they can be done is the RICE method. So reach, impact, and confidence. So like, how confident are you that this project or this idea is actually going to have the value you're expecting? What is the impact? And then what is the reach? So when you think about reach, oftentimes this is the number of departments involved, the number of people involved. Oftentimes this comes into play in terms of the amount of change that's going on across the organization, as well as the impact. And when we think about impact, you can definitely think about, again, return on investment for sure, but like, are we thinking this is an impact in the short term, in the long term? How big of an impact? Is it a financial impact? Is it employee satisfaction impact? Like what that is, divided by the actual effort. So the sizing of a given project, initiative, et cetera. Eisenhower method we just talked about, so important and urgent. So we definitely have situations where something's end of life, something's coming up, there's a huge new opportunity for marketing, there's something going on. So what is important and what is urgent? And some of the important things are not urgent, right? They're longer term, but you can't put them off forever, or you're losing an opportunity. One of the visuals we like to use when we're talking about project prioritization is thinking about it more on a matrix side of things in terms of like what those scales are. So if you're picking which project, right, one of the pieces might be budget that you're thinking about, right? And so what we're looking for is some way to show what's more expensive and less expensive, and something to show the impact or growth, right, in terms of the short term versus the long term, and then potentially using like effort as the size of the box. So you're kind of showing three different things here. You're showing, instead of just the two different concepts, you're showing three, because you're able to add the second one or the third one by by adding the size of something and or adding the color of it. So there's actually tools associated with this that you can use. I'm just using a high level visual to kind of make this concept. But when you are looking at projects, what are those selection criteria? One of them for sure is the strategic goals of the organization, what you're looking to do, profitability, whether you're looking to expand into a new market, into Europe, or whatever that looks like. But we do need to have this concept of short-term and long-term. We need this concept of what it costs, whether that is financial cost, estimate, resources, et cetera. Make sense? So with project prioritization and selection and intake and everything, one of the pieces is making sure that you have a balanced portfolio. So are you able to look at all the different drivers, the strategic goals that you might have, and actually be able to say, okay, well, we need these things in the short term in order to get us to the long term, or something like that. Can we look at the importance of opportunity costs? If we don't do this, what does that look like? If we do this, what other things could we have been doing? So you're not just looking at it in a black box of like one project, one initiative, but rather in the context of the whole. Ignoring sunk costs. This is probably one of the hardest biases to get by, which is when you're selecting a new project, when you're determining the project priority of something that might go forward, not overly being biased to the other projects that are already happening, the other costs. There could be something, new opportunity that comes out unexpectedly and needs to get fast tracked through, that's going to be more important than the project that's already approved, already in place. How do you work with your team to make that possible? How do you move forward with that? So ChatGPT is a great example for a lot of the big tech giants right now. They probably had a lot of different projects they were working on, a lot of different ideas, products, and things like that. But when that came out, basically it reoriented the entire focus. And that does happen. And it's not only done on an annual basis or on a time, like on a specific time. Like outside market factors, macroeconomic factors come in and require us to realign, reprioritize on a regular basis. So ecosystem view, opt-out versus opt-in. I think this is important when we think about projects, because one of the big pieces we see, and we talked a little bit about it for, a resource manager, or a team leader, a director, where they're kind of like, does this impact my team? One of the biggest pieces I like to do when we're implementing, helping an organization implement an intake workflow, is say, instead of having the sponsor, the person that's pushing the project forward, determine who it impacts or who's interested or who should get a vote or who should be looking at it. Instead, we actually use the opt-out, saying, I'm not interested in talking about this. This doesn't impact me. So actually putting the onus back on the actual other people to say, nope, this isn't me, instead of assigning it out. So it's an interesting concept that comes in play again with that project selection criteria and who's impacted by a given project or initiative. One of the most common, and it's really interesting because it's still oftentimes done in a very, often, honestly, Fortune 10 companies are still using Excel in some cases to really do some of this prioritization matrix, back end work. So in this example, we just gave a list of projects, right? And we gave a list of, very high level project selection criteria, prioritization drivers, strategic goals, whatever you want to say. Right now, these are just selection criteria, right? And you want to be able to kind of put in a vote, if it makes sense, like a 1 to 5 vote on how this project is going to impact this strategic goal, this project driver. But you also want to be able to add this concept of weight. So what is the most important of these drivers at this given moment, and how does that impact the priority? And so this is just a visual of like a very simplistic version of, okay, we want to be able to rank these different projects, potential projects, against these strategic goals or objectives or prioritization drivers, project selection criteria, whatever you call them. You want to be able to score them, but you want to add this extra layer in of how are those weighted? How are those, and what's interesting about this is that this weighting can change. So obviously with COVID, with what's going on in the economic ecosystem right now, with what's going on, between war and everything else that's going on in the world, things can change very rapidly. How this project impacts the revenue streams, diversification of the revenue streams, probably is not going to change, but how important diversifying revenue streams is compared to profitability or compared to budget or something like that, that may change that may change very quickly. So anyways, we're just kind of showing an example here. So anyways, that drives me, I'm at 142. So I want to just touch base very briefly on StrAlign. We talked a little bit about strategic alignment. We talked a little bit about bridging that gap between strategic goals and identifying what ideas, potential projects there are, and then the actual project prioritization process itself. And StrAlign is Echo's attempt at doing this. So we're really taking what you saw in that project prioritization, where you might have a PPM tool. Again, we use Smartsheet and Monday, whether you use Clarity PPM, whether you use, there's a lot of different systems out there, including ERPs and SAPs and all those other good things. But how are you tracking? How are you showing those strategic goals? And how are you ranking your ideas and projects against them? And so StrAlign is the concept is that there's strategic goals, right? Then there is this process that we just talked about, intaking, delivering the project, closing, and there's this strategic decision making that needs to happen, and that's where StrAlign comes in. So it really helps with bridging the gap between the strategic goals and intake. And what does that mean, right? So if you think about it, there's team members that have ideas, there's departments and things like that. And then there's the strategic goals from your executive leadership team, from your leadership. And then there's this concept of dynamic prioritization. Prioritization happens every day in little micro decisions that we all make. But with StrAlign, it actually makes it easy for individual users to be able to vote on how they think an idea or project impacts a strategic goal. You can weight different users. So if you want to weight your CEO or your director of finance or sales differently than someone that might be a customer service person on the front lines, and you can also weight your goals or your prioritization drivers differently. So if we go back to this kind of this concept of prioritization matrix, what we've done is we've provided a user interface that bridges that list of projects you might have, that intake, that approval workflow, right, with an actual software that allows you to collect votes, be able to see that, and be able to do some scenario planning. So really where we're implementing StrAlign right now is in this annual planning and budget planning place, but also strategic planning, PPM, PMO. So PPM, project portfolio management, project management office or organization, project prioritization, but also for decision-making facilitation, even outside of the project management and annual planning piece. One of the big things we didn't get a chance to talk too much about, but I want to make sure we have time for some questions and to go back and things like that, is the fact that we are constantly going to need to pivot. So when you make prioritization decisions, it's not just approving a project. It's also saying no to a project. It's also pausing a project that might exist. It's really, really important. Communicate, communicate, communicate articulate the priorities, articulate what is important for goals, etc., at multiple levels for your team. There are goals that are at your entire company level. There are goals that are for your individual team. There are goals for yourself as an individual. We want to make sure that we're mapping the team and individual priorities back to the big picture. And when we say big picture, those are those strategic goals, those strategic teams, etc. We want to make sure that you have time for prioritization and that you're communicating the plan with your team, but also with the requesters and the business stakeholders and your leadership team. We want to make sure that we are empowering teams to go ahead and make their own. You can't make every single decision every single day for every single person. So it's really important that you are providing that visibility to what are those strategic goals, right? How are those impacted by the projects that you have? And what is that relative priority? And it's not, you can't just prioritize at a project level, right? Like there's prioritization for a milestone or activity level, individuals for like a day-to-day level. When projects are canceled midstream, we talk a lot about making sure that you do have room for grief, right? Acknowledging the value of the work that has been done to date, allowing time for grief relative to the amount of work completed, highlighting dependencies, synergies. You're not, even if there's a great quote, I should have brought it in, but it's like, if you need to start over, right, you're not starting from scratch, you're starting from experience or something along those lines. Someone said it much better than I did. But there's this concept that, an iterative and things like that, just because a project maybe isn't finishing, something else comes in on top of it, that work to date is still of value and still did provide value to the organization. So I'm going to pause for a second. We got about 13 minutes left. I've got more, but I want to make sure there's any time for any questions. I think that's an old slide. I'm going to go back here. So if you do have any questions and things like that, you can go back to some additional concepts that we wanted to talk about in the beginning. You are welcome to reach out. Again, Echo Consulting, we're a project management services organization. We really love that intake and prioritization and things like that. Today we talked about it more from like a conceptual basis, right? But we definitely do a lot of tool implementations as well in the people, process, and technology blend. So how are we bridging that gap between what those strategic goals are and the actual project delivery teams, what the changing priorities are, how we can bridge that gap between how a project goes back to that strategic goal. Great. Thank you everyone for your time. We'll be following up in email with a recording of the webinar and a couple other helpful resources that are associated with project intake and prioritization. Thank you for your time today. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Molly.
Bye, everyone.